to prove your worth anymore. You weren't fighting to be seen. You realized that staying wasn't love, it was survival. And you got tired of surviving a love that didn't feel safe. He thought he still had control over your emotions. He thought he could pull you back in with the right words, the right apology, the right timing. But he didn't understand the damage wasn't in the arguments, it was in the repetition. The same cycle, the same promises, the same disappointment. You weren't walking away because you stopped loving him. You were walking away because you finally started loving yourself. And when you didn't come back, that's when it hit him. That's when silence became real. That's when your absence stopped being a threat and became a reality. And for the first time, he had to sit with the consequences of thinking you'd always be available. And he prepared for this version of you, the version that doesn't beg, doesn't explain, doesn't return to the same fire expecting warmth. He didn't expect you to choose peace over passion, clarity over confusion, distance over dysfunction, because in his mind, love was proven by how much you were willing to endure. But in your mind, love had to be mutual. It had to feel safe. It had to be real. So no, you didn't come back this time, not because you didn't care, but because caring was killing you. And you finally understood that healing meant not reopening the same wound just to see if it still hurt. He expected the cycle to continue. He expected history to repeat, but you broke it. And that silence, that was your closure. Tina Hill here, signing out from Philadelphia, part 261. The wheels are bigger than your skirt, the feeling that looks pretty on the outside, but in the way that hurts before it helps. The kind of healing, you are reclaiming your space. You are finally doing something you had put off for too long, taking care of yourself. And not in the way that looks pretty on the outside, but in the way that hurts before it helps. The kind of healing that comes with sitting in the truth, feeling the pain, and refusing to run from it. He thought your silence was just a reaction, but it wasn't. It was a response, a conscious one, a mature one. You didn't go quiet because you were afraid. You went quiet because you were ready to face yourself, ready to rebuild what got torn apart inside of you, ready to stop looking for love in someone who couldn't even love themselves properly. And here's the part he never saw coming. When a woman starts healing, she becomes unrecognizable to the version of herself that stayed in cycles. She starts asking different questions. She starts needing different things. She no longer finds comfort in chaos or validation in attention. She seeks peace, and not just any kind of peace, but the kind that makes her protective of her silence, selective with her energy, and unwilling to explain her worth to anyone again. He thought the silence meant you were punishing him, but you weren't. You weren't trying to make him feel what you felt. That wasn't your goal. The truth is you let go because you had to, because your healing couldn't happen in the same place that broke you. You couldn't find peace in a heart that didn't know how to hold you. You couldn't find clarity in conversations that kept spinning you in circles. You see, healing doesn't always look powerful at first. It looks like lonely nights, like crying in silence, like missing someone you had to walk away from. But slowly, it starts to look like freedom. You stop checking your phone. You stop replaying the last conversation. You stop waiting for the apology. Because healing isn't about them, it's about you. It's about learning to sit with yourself and not feel empty. It's about learning that your worth was never tied to who stayed or who didn't. And the most powerful part of healing, it's when you no longer need closure from the one who hurt you. You realize that their silence, their inconsistency, their confusion, none of it was about you. You stop personalizing their behavior. You stop internalizing their absence. Because when you start healing, you learn the difference between being abandoned and being redirected. And in hindsight, that silence wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a better version of you. He didn't expect you to heal. He expected you to hurt. to struggle, to regret. But instead, you grew, you evolved, you glowed differently because pain has a way of becoming power when you stop letting it define you. He thought the silence was a pause, but really, it was a transformation. He thought silence meant weakness. He thought because you weren't speaking, you were folding. He thought your quiet meant defeat, that maybe you were too broken to respond, too hurt to fight back, too lost to walk away for real. What he didn't understand is that silence is often the loudest form of strength. You weren't giving up. You were getting up, just without the noise. See, some people expect you to fall apart loudly. They expect the yelling, the begging, the chaos, because that keeps the attention on them. That keeps the drama alive. That keeps the illusion going, that they still matter enough to pull you out of character. But when you go silent, when you stop feeding the fire, when you stop performing for the pain, that's when they really start to lose grip. Because silence means you're no longer playing their game. He mistook your silence for silence, but it was strategy, it was healing, it was a quiet rebuilding of everything he tried to tear down. And that's what shook him. Because silence, when it comes from strength, is terrifying to someone who thought they had control. He wasn't prepared for that kind of power. The kind that doesn't need revenge, the kind that doesn't need an audience, the kind that walks away not to prove a point, but to protect peace. And the irony is, he had all the words when he was hurting you, all the explanations, all the justifications, all the gaslighting. But now that it's quiet, now that the mirror is facing him, he has to sit with what he did without the distraction of your reaction. And that's where growth happens for you. Because when you stop reacting, you start reflecting. You start realizing how much of your energy was wasted trying to be understood by someone who didn't want to understand. Silence gave you clarity. It gave you back your focus. It reminded you of your worth, not through someone else's eyes, but through your own. You stopped needing him to validate your pain. You stopped needing him to acknowledge what he did. Because strength isn't needing an apology to move forward. It's learning how to give yourself the closure they never could. He thought you were breaking, but in silence you were building, quietly, intentionally, brick by brick. You were laying the foundation for a version of yourself that doesn't settle, doesn't chase, and doesn't shrink just to be loved. And that kind of strength, it's permanent. It doesn't need to scream to be seen. It just is. He underestimated what silence could do. You thought you'd be back or that you'd eventually explode. But instead, you evolved. And now that you're no longer explaining, reacting, or waiting, he has to live with the echo of a voice he thought would never go quiet. He thought your silence was a pause, something temporary, a momentary retreat, but what he didn't realize is that it was the space you needed to reclaim yourself. When you went silent, you weren't just holding back your words, you were holding back your heart. You weren't allowing him to take any more pieces of you without permission. You stopped giving him access to your emotions, your thoughts, and your energy because for too long, he had taken without giving anything back. In that silence, you found the strength to remember who you were before him. Before the hurt, before the disappointment, before the constant sacrifices you made. You remember that you are more than just a reaction to someone else's actions. You are a force, a being that deserves respect, love, and honor, not only from others, but from yourself. It wasn't easy. Silence doesn't come with comfort. It's not a quiet walk through peace. It's often filled with confusion, questions, and moments of doubt. The urge to reach out, to explain, to fix things is overwhelming at times. But you resisted. You resisted because you knew that if you kept trying to make him understand, if you kept trying to make him feel what you felt, it would only lead you back into the same painful cycle. And you were tired of being stuck in that loop. The truth is, silence gave you the clarity to see things for what they really were, not for what you hoped they could be. You stopped seeing him as the person you wanted him to be and started seeing him for who he actually was. the one who constantly took your peace, took your love, and never gave back. That's when you realized that your silence wasn't just about withdrawing from him, it was about protecting yourself from further damage. It was about loving yourself enough to stop giving to someone who was too broken to see your value. What he never understood is that when you stop speaking, when you stop fighting for someone who isn't fighting for you, something powerful happens inside you. You start healing. And that healing isn't just about mending the hurt, it's about becoming stronger than you ever were before. You become aware of your worth in a way that silence reveals. You stop looking to him for validation because you begin to give yourself the love, respect, and kindness that you were seeking from him. You stop needing his apology, his acknowledgement, or his understanding because you realize you can give all that to yourself. He thought silence meant you were weak or defeated, but in reality, it was the strongest thing you could have done. It was the moment you took back your power. You stopped giving him a front row seat to your emotions. You stopped letting him play with your heart like it was his to break. You reclaimed your life, your time, and your peace. And that's what he never expected. He never thought you would be strong enough to go silent and mean it. He never expected you to leave behind the endless explanations and just walk away. But that's the kind of strength silence brings. It's the kind that doesn't beg for attention or validation. It's the kind that stands firm in its own truth and refuses to be shaken. He thought you'd be lost without him. But what he didn't understand is that you weren't lost. You were found again, found in your silence, found in your peace, found in the strength to walk away from someone who wasn't worthy of your love. He thought that your silence would push him away for only so long before you'd come running back. He believed that if he waited long enough, if he gave you some space, you would eventually soften, eventually cave, eventually return to the person you used to be, the one who would always forgive, always make excuses, always come back. But he didn't understand the power of your absence. He didn't understand that it wasn't just a space between words, it was a space between who you were and who you were becoming. And that gap wasn't one he could bridge anymore. You see, silence isn't about punishment, it's about protection. And when you pulled back, you were protecting yourself from further harm. You were protecting your heart from becoming numb, from becoming so conditioned to disappointment that you forgot the meaning of your own worth. The silence you chose wasn't a retreat from him, it was a retreat to yourself. It was a declaration that your peace mattered more than anything else, that your soul deserved more than the chaos he brought into your life. For so long, you had tried to explain yourself, tried to make him understand your pain, tried to make him see how much you cared, how much you were willing to give. But in doing so, you lost yourself. You started measuring your worth by his ability to recognize it, to appreciate it, to reciprocate it. And when he failed to do so again and again, you didn't just lose trust in him. You started losing trust in yourself. You started doubting whether you were worth the kind of love you were giving, whether you were worthy of the kind of respect you deserved. But silence, true silence, was your way of saying no more. He didn't expect that. He thought silence meant you were struggling, but in reality, you were finding yourself. You were putting the pieces of your heart back together, slowly but surely, and rebuilding the parts of you that he had taken for granted. Silence allowed you to do something you hadn't done in so long. Listen to your own voice. It allowed you to hear your own needs, your own desires, and most importantly, your own worth. And what you realized was this: you didn't need him to validate you. You didn't need him to tell you what you were worth. You already knew. As you sat in that silence, you started understanding that it wasn't about getting him to change. It was about deciding that you would no longer accept anything less than the love you truly deserved. It was about saying to yourself, I am enough, with or without him. And that was the key. The silence wasn't just a reaction to his behavior. It was a response to the way you had been treating yourself. You were giving yourself the love, the time, and the space that you had been giving him, but never receiving in return. You weren't doing this to punish him. You were doing it to free yourself. You stopped chasing. You stopped explaining. You stopped trying to be understood by someone who couldn't see you for who you truly were. And that That was the moment when everything started to shift. You began to see your own strength, your own resilience, and your own ability to stand on your own. And in that shift, you realized that you were no longer waiting for him to see you. You had started seeing yourself in a whole new light. And he didn't expect that. He didn't expect that silence would become your catalyst for growth, your opportunity to rediscover your own worth. He thought it was just an obstacle to get past, a phase you would get over. But in that silence, you found clarity, you found peace, you found your own voice, and you realized you didn't need to beg for his attention anymore. You didn't need to prove your love to him. You didn't need to be the person who always came back to fix what he had broken. Instead, you became the person who fixed herself first. You became the person who no longer apologized for needing space, for needing time, for needing respect. You became the person who walked away with her head high, no longer carrying the weight of someone else's indifference. And in doing so, you showed him, without saying a word, that the most powerful thing you could ever do was choose yourself. He underestimated the depth of your silence. He thought it was a sign of weakness, an indication that you were too afraid to confront him, too afraid to stand up for yourself. What he didn't realize was that your silence was a form of strength that he could never understand. It was the kind of strength that doesn't need to shout, doesn't need to beg, doesn't need to demand attention. It was the kind of strength that doesn't make noise because it's rooted in something far more powerful, self-respect. When you went silent, you weren't giving up on him. You were giving up on the idea that he could continue to be the person who controlled your emotions, your thoughts, your peace. You stopped allowing him to dictate your mood, your happiness, and your worth. And in that silence, you found something far greater than the validation he could never provide. You found your own voice, but he never expected that. He never imagined that by shutting him out, you would open yourself up to a version of yourself that was free from his influence, a version of you that could stand strong, independent, and whole without needing him to fix what wasn't broken. And when you stopped responding to his attempts to pull you back into the drama, you weren't just walking away. You were walking towards something much greater, the life you deserve, the life that doesn't revolve around constantly fighting for someone's attention, someone's approval, someone's love. You were walking towards peace. You were walking towards self-love. What he failed to understand was that your silence wasn't a sign of defeat, but a sign of transformation. Every time you chose silence, you were choosing yourself. You were choosing not to invest in a relationship that drained you, not to engage in conversations that left you feeling empty, not to waste your energy on someone who didn't appreciate you the way you deserved. Every moment you remained silent, you were teaching yourself the value of your own presence. You were reminding yourself that you didn't need to prove your worth to anyone, least of all, him. In that silence, you found clarity. You stopped trying to make him see what he wasn't capable of seeing. You stopped needing him to acknowledge your pain, your efforts, your love. Because in silence, you came to realize that none of that mattered as much as your own peace. You stopped measuring your value by how he treated you and began measuring it by how you treated yourself. He thought your silence would break you. He thought that the longer you stayed quiet, the more desperate you would become for his attention. But instead, it was the silence that allowed you to finally hear your own voice. It was the silence that allowed you to listen to your heart, to reconnect with your purpose, and to rediscover the strength you had been hiding for so long. It was the silence that allowed you to realize that you didn't need to beg for respect, to plead for love, or to wait for him to see your worth. You had already found it within yourself. The truth is, silence is often the most powerful response to a situation where words have failed. Silence forces people to sit with their own actions. It forces them to reflect on what they've done and what they've lost. But even more importantly, silence allows you to regain control over your life, your heart, and your future. It allows you to set boundaries, to stop giving more than you're receiving, and to protect your peace. It allows you to finally stop sacrificing your happiness for someone who isn't willing to fight for it with you. He thought your silence would make you small, make you vulnerable, make you come running back. But what he didn't expect was that your silence would make you bigger. It would make you stronger. It would make you someone who no longer needed to explain herself to anyone. It would make you the kind of person who doesn't have to settle, doesn't have to chase, doesn't have to beg. And that's the kind of power he'll never understand. Because silence isn't empty. It's filled with growth, self-respect, and the kind of strength that leaves no room for anything or anyone who isn't worthy of it. So as you stand in this silence, remember that you are not broken. You are not weak. You are not lost. You are finding your way back to yourself. And as you continue to walk in that silence, you will only grow stronger, more confident, and more aware of the amazing life that awaits you when you stop giving energy to what no longer serves you. Because silence doesn't mean you've given up. It means you finally started to choose yourself. He never thought that your silence would be permanent. He thought that sooner or later you'd break down, that the distance between you two would push you to the point where you'd come crawling back, ready to forgive, ready to forget. But what he didn't realize is that your silence wasn't just a moment of withdrawal. It was a reflection of your growth. It was the first step you took toward reclaiming your power, your peace, your worth. For so long, you had allowed your emotions to be dictated by his actions, your thoughts to be clouded by his inconsistencies, and your heart to be held hostage by promises that were never kept. You tried so many times to make it work, to bridge the gap, to get him to see what you were willing to give. But each time, you were left empty. Each time, he took more from you and gave nothing in return. And with each disappointment, you slowly lost a piece of yourself. But when you chose silence, you weren't just retreating, you were drawing a line that said, I am worth more than this. A line that told you that you deserve a love that isn't based on hope alone, but on actions, respect, and mutual care. Your silence wasn't a sign of weakness or abandonment. It was a declaration of self-respect. It was a reminder that you could stand on your own, that you could find your own peace without needing anyone else to validate it. It wasn't just a retreat. It was your stepping into your own power. What he failed to grasp is that silence isn't about giving up. It's about clarity. And in that space of silence, you found the clarity you had been searching for. You stopped waiting for someone to come around, to apologize, to realize how much you had sacrificed. Because in that silence, you realized something that changed everything. You didn't need anyone to see your value for you, to know your worth. You had spent so much time trying to make him understand, but in doing so, you had neglected the most important relationship of all, the one with yourself. And when you stopped focusing on him, you started focusing on you. That's when you began to hear your own voice, the voice that had been drowned out for so long by his words, his needs, his demands. You heard the truth of what you wanted, what you needed, and what you deserved. You heard the truth that you were not here to be a pawn in someone else's game. You were here to live a life of peace, of love, and of fulfillment. And none of that could happen until you learned to put yourself first. Your silence gave you the space to heal. It gave you the space to rebuild the parts of yourself that had been chipped away by disappointments and heartache. It gave you the time to rediscover your passions, your goals, and your worth. And with every day that passed, you grew stronger. You grew more independent, more aware of your own needs, and less willing to settle for anything less than the love you truly deserve. But he never thought it would last. He thought you'd come back to him when the silence became too loud, when the emptiness became too overwhelming. He thought you'd be the same person who would bend over backward, who would compromise, who would accept the scraps of affection he was willing to give. But the person who walked away wasn't the same person who stepped into that silence. You weren't the same because you had changed. You had learned that your peace, your happiness, and your worth didn't depend on him or anyone else. They depended on you. He couldn't understand that. He didn't realize that by continuing to push you away, he was actually pushing you toward yourself. He thought that by giving you space, you'd feel the emptiness and rush back to fill it. But you didn't need him to fill the space anymore. You had learned how to fill it yourself, how to create a life that was whole, a life that wasn't dependent on anyone's approval or affection. You had learned that silence wasn't a void, it was a sanctuary. And in that sanctuary, you found the strength to be the person you had always been meant to be. The silence you chose wasn't about holding on to grudges, it wasn't about punishing him, and it wasn't about playing games. It was about respecting yourself enough to stop allowing someone who didn't value you to continue influencing your life. It was about choosing peace over chaos, love over resentment, and respect over sacrifice. You didn't need to explain yourself. You didn't need to justify your feelings. You simply needed to be still, be present, and be true to yourself. So as he watches you remain silent, he may begin to feel the weight of his own choices, the impact of his own actions. But this silence will not be broken by his regret or his apology. It will remain because you finally realize that the most powerful thing you can do is protect your peace. And once you realize that, once you find that strength, there is nothing that can pull you back into a cycle of pain, doubt, or disappointment. Because now your silence is your strength, and it's something that no one can take away from you. He never expected that silence would become your boundary, your self-preservation, your armor. He assumed that if he just pushed a little harder, you would eventually break, you would eventually bend to his will, you would eventually come running back, begging for his attention, craving his validation. What he didn't realize was that this silence wasn't just a pause, it was a sign of strength, a sign of the growth you had achieved, and the distance you had created between who you used to be and who you are now becoming. For so long, you were the one who overextended yourself, who went above and beyond, who tried to make him understand your worth, your pain, and your love. You tried to communicate with words, to show him who you were and what you needed. But the more you spoke, the more he seemed to ignore your needs, to dismiss your value, to take you for granted. It wasn't just hurtful, it was draining. It left you feeling like you were constantly fighting for something that wasn't even being valued. And as the days went on, you began to realize that no amount of words could change him. No amount of love or effort could force him to see the truth. And no amount of begging could convince him to respect what he had. So you made a choice. You chose silence. And in that silence, you began to reclaim your power. This silence was not an act of retaliation. It wasn't a tactic for manipulation, and it certainly wasn't a cry for attention. It was a shift from desperation to self-worth, from emotional dependence to emotional independence. When you went silent, you stopped giving your energy away to someone who didn't deserve it. You stopped pouring your love into a place that couldn't even recognize it, and in doing so, you created space for something far more meaningful, your own healing, your own peace, your own clarity. He didn't expect this. He didn't expect that by withdrawing, you would finally start to listen to yourself. By going quiet, you stopped seeking his approval and started seeking your own approval. You started validating yourself, realizing that the only person who truly needed to understand your worth was you. You stopped giving him the power to decide who you were. You stopped relying on him for your sense of self. And the moment you stopped waiting for him to change, you started changing for yourself. You stopped needing him to be the answer to your happiness because you realized that your happiness was never his responsibility. It was yours. What he also didn't realize was that this silence was an act of wisdom. It wasn't impulsive or reactionary. It wasn't a knee-jerk response to the pain or frustration he had caused. It was deliberate. It was intentional. You were protecting your peace. And in doing so, you were setting a precedent that you would no longer allow anyone to invade your space, your thoughts, your emotions, without respect, without love, and without the reciprocity you deserve. He thought you would get desperate. He thought you would come back to him and beg for the relationship to continue, but you didn't. And that is what shook him to his core. The fact that you had learned to walk away from something that no longer served you. In your silence, you began to heal. You allowed yourself to reflect on the relationship, on your role in it, and on what you had given and what you had received. You stopped blaming yourself for not doing more, for not being more, and for not giving more. You stopped thinking that if you just loved harder, if you just tried harder, he would change. You understood that change comes from within, and if he couldn't see his own worth, if he couldn't give you the respect you needed, then it was time to stop investing in something that was ultimately draining you. Your silence became a shield that protected your heart from further harm. It was a shield that allowed you to breathe, to feel your own emotions, to reconnect with who you truly are, and to remember that you are worthy of love that is given freely, love that is reciprocated, love that doesn't require you to beg for it. He never imagined that the moment you stopped speaking, you would begin to speak the loudest truths to yourself. Silence isn't just an absence of sound, it's a presence of self-reflection. It's a space where you begin to listen to your own thoughts, your own needs, and your own dreams. It's where you realize that you don't need anyone's approval to move forward in your life. You are enough, just as you are. And as you sat in that silence, you discovered that the power wasn't in what you said, but in what you didn't say. You didn't need to explain yourself, defend your actions, or justify your choices. You simply needed to be. The truth is, when you stop reacting, when you stop trying to force something that's not meant to be, you begin to attract the right energy. He thought your silence would push you further away from him, but in reality, it was pulling you closer to yourself. And when you pull closer to yourself, you create room for the right kind of relationships to come into your life. The kind where you are seen, heard, and valued. Your silence, your choice to stand firm in who you are, became the catalyst for that transformation. You were no longer waiting for him to change. You were waiting for yourself to grow. And in your growth, you found your true strength. And he didn't expect you to go silent forever because he didn't understand what silence meant. He thought it was a sign of giving up, a sign of defeat. But what he didn't know was that your silence was the strongest statement you could have made. It was a statement that you were not afraid to protect your peace. It was a statement that you will no longer tolerate disrespect or emotional neglect. It was a statement that you love yourself enough to walk away from anything that doesn't honor who you are. And it was a statement that you are in control of your life. And no matter what he thought, this silence wasn't a loss. It was your greatest victory. In the end, your silence will speak louder than any words ever could. And it will make it clear you are not someone to be taken for granted. You are not someone who will beg for attention. And you are not someone who will settle for anything less than the love, respect, and peace you deserve. You have shown him, and more importantly, shown yourself, that you are strong enough to walk away from anything that doesn't serve your growth. And that's the silence that will echo the longest.